This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Francis Hogan. Welcome to our reflections on the book of Genesis. I am continuing to reflect on chapter 1. We're looking at the days of creation, and I want to begin now with the 6th day, in which God creates his jewel among the whole of creation. I'll read it for you. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Here we see that Adam is the crown of creation, that everything else was made in preparation for his arrival, and that this time God does something he has not done before. He says, "Let us make man in our image." That means that man is made like God. We're not told that any of the animals or the plants or the stars or the galaxies or anything else was made in the image of God, but man is made in the image of God, and therefore he's in a completely different relationship between himself and God, and a completely different relationship between himself and creation. And immediately he is appointed as Lord of the earth. Now, as we go through from Genesis 1 to Genesis 6 and beyond, it's going to be important as to who is the Lord of the earth and who fights for this position, even if he has not been appointed for this position. But God has appointed Adam as Lord of the earth, so he has dominion over the rest of creation. And then from verse 29, he says something else. God said, "See, I have given you every herb that yields seed and is on the face of the earth, and every tree that gives fruit for your food." In verse 30, he says, "Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird in the air, and everything that creeps on the earth, I've given green plants as food." Now, there's no mention here in chapter 1 that man can eat animals. Both man and animals are given plants for food. And we need to look at this at least for a moment, because everything that God does is right, and everything that he does is perfect. Okay. One of the things about the food thing is that man himself was made from the earth. This has become even more graphic for us when it comes to chapter 2. And the description of the making of man is given in chapter 2. Man is of the earth, earthly, and therefore the elements of the earth are in us, and the elements of the earth are in the plants, and therefore everything that the plants have is suitable for us. That's the logic of what we're being told here. So man isn't made until the whole earth is complete. The heavens and the earth are all complete, and if you like, the house is ready. And so he places his son in the house. Now, we will get a lovely image of this in chapter 2, but I'll wait until there. And man is made Lord of the earth, or what we would say a CEO, somebody in charge of the whole thing. And so he's created in the image of God. Now, if he's created in the image of God, he must actually be in communion with God, and he must be one with the will of God. Therefore, his lordship over the earth is not independent of God. It is under God that he does this. And we're going to see in chapter 3 that when he moves away from the surrender to the lordship of God, that he himself loses his lordship as well. He can only do it under God and in the will of God. Now, chapter 2 will tell us how the man was made in the icon of God. In chapter 1, it is simply stated that this is so. You will see very quickly that the authorship of chapter 1 and the authorship of chapter 2 very, very different, and that the facts that are given to us in chapter 1 are given in strict kind of liturgical reading. So it seems to come from a priestly tradition, whereas the whole event is going to be given to us in story form in chapter 2, and comes from what they call a Yahwistic tradition. It's completely different. And the way God is referred to in both cases is different. I'll point that out as well. But here, if man is made in the image of God, then we need to realize that he is created in innocence, in grace, and in the fullness of union with God. That's very important. That's very important for what happens afterwards, because it will be legitimate for us to say, how can someone as perfect as this actually fall? That will be a very important question to ask. And this person who's made in the image of God, in the likeness of God, and is in communion with God, therefore is given the right to take care of God's creation. That will be explained in chapter 2 as well. But of course, Adam can't do it by himself. It's not actually possible. And so he created the male and the female to complement each other, because Adam couldn't be the mother of the future generations. That had to be somebody else. And so the woman given to him, which will be described in chapter 2, has to be the mother of all the living. Okay, but they are told in chapter 1 to increase and multiply. Everything that God made was told to increase and multiply. The plants, the animals, and the humans, they were all told to increase and multiply. And what you find when you really look at this whole description of creation in chapter 1, that since God is life, he wants life everywhere. Heaven itself teems with angels. The earth teems with plants. The seas teem with fish. The air teems with birds. And he wants the human race to fill the earth as well. He wants his children. Why does he want Adam and Eve, as we will meet her in chapter 2, to multiply and to fill the earth? Because they are made in the image of God, and they alone, with God's help, can create other images of God. No animal can do this. An animal can only reproduce its own kind. There's only one species made in the image of God, and therefore there's only one species that can actually produce others in the image of God. And so this was the important task that was given to Adam and Eve. The emphasis is on everything is good. Everything comes from a good God. And what God does with Adam is expressed very nicely in Psalm 8. O Lord, our God, how great is your name throughout all the earth. Above the heavens is your majesty chanted by the mouths of children and babes in arms. You set your stronghold firm against your foes to subdue enemies and rebels. When I look at the heavens made by your fingers, at the moon and the stars which you set in place, what is man that you would even spare a thought for him, or the son of man that you would care for him? And yet you made him little less than a god. You've crowned him with glory and honor. You've made him Lord over the work of your hands, and you set all things under his feet. O Lord our God, how great is your name throughout all the earth. So the amazing thing is that Psalm 8 tells you how to look at Genesis chapter 1, that you look at the magnificence of God's creation and the nothingness of this creature that has been brought out of the dust of the earth. And yet, since we are nothing of ourselves, the incredible thing is that God has made us like him, and like him, we are allowed to be the rulers of the earth. It's totally amazing, totally amazing. But you can see that the ancient peoples got the message. They actually understood it. I'm not sure if too many people nowadays actually get the message, because we don't really contemplate the heavens the way they do. We're inclined to take a very cold scientific approach to things. I told you that when you come into the book of Genesis, that things are not what they seem. And let's come to the 6 days of creation. The 7th day is the rest day. We'll come to that later. Okay. But let's look at the 6 days and see if there is a deeper meaning than we would suspect. And you find that these 6 days represent, well, shall I say the 7, I'll include the 7th day. The 7 days represent the 7 ages of man. It represents the 7 stages of history. And so instead of thinking 6 or 7 days in terms of 24-hour days and thinking that there's some kind of a contradiction between the actual age of the earth and this, that's not the way you look at it. For example, day 1 in human history is the age of innocence. That is between the creation of Adam in chapter 1 and the fall of Adam in chapter 3. It's a very short time. Okay. And each time I give you a day, I want to show you how it ends. This day of innocence ended in the fall of the human race, the fall of Adam, and in the expulsion from the Garden of Paradise. So it begins in glory, it ends in disgrace, ends in shame. So you come to day 2. So day 2 is the age of conscience. As soon as this new stage happens, then God awakens in us the alertness, an interior alertness to what is good and what is evil, because we have seen the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We've seen their fruits. Therefore, conscience tells us there are 2 ways. We'll deal with that in chapter 3. So the age of conscience appears to last. It's with us all the time, of course, but according to these days, it appears to last for 2,000 years. And it goes from the children of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, who died, and then Seth, and it goes on to Noah. And it ends in the flood and the expulsion of humanity from the earth. Now, we start with the expulsion of humanity from the Garden of Paradise. And by chapter 6, we have the expulsion of humanity from the earth itself. That's a pretty fast fall. So you have the fall of the first parents, and then you have the fall of all their children in a very quick spiral downwards. Okay. On day 3, the earth had to emerge from the waters again. Do you remember it was day 3 in creation? And when the earth emerged from the waters, then Noah and his sons and their wives could start repeopling the earth again. Okay, so this is the age of human government. And it's at this point that the new thing comes in, that human beings want to rule the earth without being in communion with God. And this starts the disaster of human history. They want to do it outside of union with God, outside of God's will, and that's where disaster actually comes. And so this starts with the children of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it goes to what we call traditionally the Tower of Babel, Babel. That is the false god Bel. Okay, and it ended with the judgment of Babel and the people scattered all over the earth. So at least this time they were left on the earth. They weren't destroyed. Okay, they were scattered all over the earth. So on day 4, we have the age of promise, and that is the call of God to humanity to return to him and begin the long, long journey back to union with God and to the will of God, starting with Abraham. And this day 4 begins with Abraham, and it goes as far as the sojourn in Egypt, when Jacob brings his entire family down to Egypt. And where does it end? It ends in slavery, physical slavery in Egypt, and slavery to false gods as well. It's absolutely incredible. Spiritual and temporal slavery. I don't know how you feel when you read the first book of the Bible. I feel very sorry for God, because everything he does for us, we throw it back in his face. We manage to rebel against him under every government that he gives us, every dispensation he gives us, every environment he gives us, no matter what he does to try and enable us to live, we manage to throw it back in his face. It's really quite incredible. And God comes back, the eternal optimist. And so in day 5, we have the age of the law. And the law was given to Moses, and it lasts from Moses until the exile. Of course, the law of Moses still continues for Jewish people and believers of the covenant of Moses. But in terms of days, it lasts from the giving of the law in Exodus to the exile. And the exile took place in 2 stages. The northern kingdom first was sent out into Assyria. They never returned. That was 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel lost forever. And then nearly 100 years later, the southern kingdom of Judah sent off to Babylonia. Now, as we go through Genesis, you will realize it all starts in Babylonia. And so that's called going back to square one. But they did actually return. And so in the end, God had a tiny remnant that returned from exile to rebuild Jerusalem and to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. So by the time Jesus came, the number of believers was very, very small. And it reflects where we're at now. Okay, so that's day 5. So we're going to realize in chapter 2 that this Garden of Eden is actually in Babylonia. Nowadays, we call it Iraq, southern Iraq. Okay, and the people are actually sent right back to there after the exile. So then you have the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And that age, it continues to the judgment of God on Calvary for sin, where Jesus took all the failures of the covenant of Moses. He took everything, of course, but I'm just illustrating it this way, and took it to the cross and made atonement for it. That began day 6, which was the day of redemption. And this is the day of grace and mercy. And it comes from the incarnation of Jesus, and it goes to the second coming, the first coming and the second coming of Jesus. And it ends with the judgments that are given in the book of Revelation in preparation for the final return of Jesus. And you'll say, after all this trouble, doesn't God get anything? Doesn't he get anything out of it? That's why I feel so sorry for God. And he has a day 7. That's why I didn't read day 7 for you yet, because day 7 is the Shabbat, the Sabbath, we call it in English. It's God's day. It's the rest day. And when John does the 7 days of the new creation in the Gospel of John in chapter 1, the 6th day is not actually mentioned by John because it's the whole gospel. And on the 7th day, you have Jesus resting in the tomb after the labor of redemption. Okay, just as God rested on the 7th day after the labor of creation. All right, jump to the 7th day of history, or the 7th age of the human race. And it's the age of God's kingdom on earth, the new era called the New Jerusalem. It's called Paradise Restored. It's called the Kingdom of God on earth. It's called the Millennium because it's spoken about as the 1,000-year reign of Christ, which of course simply means the time, because with God 1,000 years is like a single day. But it's God's day. It's God's time. And how does that finish? It also finishes in judgment, in the final judgment of the human race before the great white throne. That is Revelation chapter 20, when all humanity will have to face their Creator, and they will have to face how they responded to the life, the grace, the light, the love, the mercy, the goodness. They will have to face it because we were made in the image of God. We were made like him, and therefore we have to be responsible. And we'll see in chapter 3 that he insists that part of this likeness is that we are actually responsible for what we do. And so the Bible begins with creation and ends in eternity. And hopefully very many of the human race actually reach it to eternity. Okay, so let me just give you a tiny summary so that you will hear what I've just said. Man's attempt to run the human race without God fails every single time. On day 1, he was expelled from paradise. On day 2, he was expelled from the earth itself. On day 3, he was scattered all over the earth. On day 4, he ended up in hell. That is spiritual and temporal slavery. On day 5, Jesus dealt with sin on Calvary. Day 6, we have the purification of the earth. And day 7, at long last, we have the Shabbat, God's day. To finish the reflection on chapter 1 of Genesis, I want to give you a comparison, a reflection that puts the first Adam and the last Adam side by side, that we compare them. Because when you look at them together, you'll find that one points to the other. And this is where we come in with our types, that the first Adam is not the last Adam, and the last Adam is not the first Adam, but the way God has actually allowed things to happen is that we can learn an awful lot about Jesus by looking at some of these early characters that we find in the Bible. So let's start with 1 Corinthians 15:45, where St. Paul says that the first man, Adam, became a living soul, but the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Adam was a son of God, created by God himself. He was a son in an absolutely unique way. He was created in grace. He knew God personally. He had his own will and the divine will were one. They were combined together. He was totally surrendered to God. He had knowledge, gifts, and all kinds of infused knowledge and understanding given to him. But that says an awful lot about him. But when you look down at the last Adam, it is actually completely different, because he is the eternal, uncreated Son of God, the second person of the Most Holy Trinity. Nothing can compare with this. So I want to read for you Colossians 1:15-20, speaking about the supremacy of Christ. He is the image of the invisible God. Image is icon. He is the firstborn of all creation. You see, Adam was the firstborn, but Christ is truly the firstborn because he is the uncreated Son of God. For by him all things were created. Now you see that you actually need the New Testament to help you to understand the Old Testament. I've just said to you that 10 times in chapter 1, it says, and God said, he sent forth his word and things came into being. Now you're told by St. Paul, that word was the uncreated word of God that became incarnate as our Savior. Listen to this. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and things on earth, things that are visible and things that are invisible, whether they are thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For the fullness of God bodily dwelt in him. Now, in giving you scripture readings, I'm using a number of translations. Sometimes I combine translations together. That's the New International Version in this little one. So while Adam is the firstborn, when you come to look at Jesus, you're looking at somebody so much higher than him that Adam is very, 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 very small. But he still points to him. And this is where looking at the types is actually very important. When you go to St. Luke's Gospel, for example, in chapter 3 and verse 38, in the genealogy of Jesus, we're told that he was the son of Adam and the son of God. Okay. Now, the amazing thing is that Adam was the son of God in a different sense because he wasn't divine. Adam also points to Jesus as being the husband of Eve, the mother of all the living. And Paul tells us in Ephesians 5:31 and 32, that points to Jesus as the husband of the church, his chosen bride. Okay. Adam was promised numerous posterity, that he was to fill the whole earth. And this actually points to Jesus' spiritual children. One of the things that can surprise people is that Jesus was a young 33-year-old. We traditionally say he was probably much older than that, probably 37 or 38, unmarried. where would you get the children from? And to die childless for a Jewish man at that time was complete shame. But there is an extraordinary prophetic piece given to us at the end of Psalm 22, which prophetically describes the crucifixion and death of Jesus. And it describes his posterity in a most wonderful way, where he says from verse 27, the whole earth from end to end will remember and come back to the Lord. All the families of the nations will bow down before him. That still has to happen. For the Lord reigns the rulers of the nations. So that's obviously day 7. Before him, all the prosperous of the earth will bow down. Before him will bow down all who go down into the dust. My soul will live for him, and my children will serve him. Men will proclaim the Lord to generations still to come, his righteousness to a people yet unborn. All this he has done. That's the consummatum est of the Old Testament. So the children of Jesus are all those who are baptized into Christ. They're his children. And over the history, he has myriads of children. He has a huge family. So yes, his children are scattered all over the earth, just as the children of Adam are scattered all over the earth. We're told that Adam was made the Lord of the earth, and Jesus is not just the head of the church, Colossians 1:18. He's the King of kings and the Lord of lords, we're told in Revelation 19:16. What did Adam pass on to his children? He passed on guilt and shame and distress, everything to his descendants. But Jesus passed on his holiness, his righteousness and redemption and all the goodness of God to his children. St. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that the first man was of the earth, but that the second one was from heaven. Adam was from the earth. Literally, Adama means dust. So if we were to call him by his true name in English, you'd call him Dusty. But the second one was from heaven. He is the uncreated Word of God become incarnate among us. Okay. So the first man, Adam, he brought death to humanity. The second one, he brought life to everyone. And he brought resurrection from death. I think one of the most extraordinary events that could happen on this earth was simply resurrection, because you went from the heights of Adam being in union with God down into the depths of death and whatever happens after death. It must have been, I'll show you this when we come to chapter 4, one of the most frightening things for Adam and Eve was to look at their lifeless son, Abel. They didn't know what death was until then. And most of us don't know what it looks like until you see someone you love no longer breathing, no longer looking at you, no longer responding. It's the most frightening moment you can have. And so resurrection from death and the promise of an eternal resurrection so that we live forever with God is the most astonishing, the most moving, the most incredible, the most transforming thing that we can be told. And that was the gift of Jesus. He told us he would raise us from the dead, and he illustrated it in raising the little 12-year-old girl and in raising Lazarus from the dead. And so I want to just sort of read a passage from Isaiah again that brings us sort of a sense of the joy of this. Isaiah 61:10. I exult for joy in the Lord. My soul rejoices in my God, for he has clothed me in the garments of salvation. He has wrapped me in the cloak of integrity. Now, that also fits the next point that I want to make as well, and that is that after the fall, God himself clothed Adam and Eve with garments, okay? And we're told that he covered them. And you need to realize that words that are used in the scriptures are used very carefully. And when you go back and look at the Hebrew word and the exact meaning of it, you realize that you miss an awful lot if you stay with the translation, because the Hebrew word for to cover up means atonement. And the reason why Isaiah would say that we exult for joy because the Lord has clothed us with the garments of salvation was because the second Adam made atonement for the human race and therefore reclothed us in grace and beauty and glory. And you see this even in the Gospels where Jesus was preparing for this, where when he dealt with the healed demoniac, he literally, physically clothed him as well. And when you see the prodigal son coming back to the father in Luke chapter 15, that prodigal son represents the whole human race gone astray. You need to understand that. And what does the father do? He reclothes him as a son. Now that reclothing means atonement has been done, the relationship is reestablished, and that we can again come back into communion with God. This is actually extremely important. So I just wanted to point out to you, therefore, that the texts here are much richer than you would realize. So I'm going to continue reading to introduce chapter 2 because it's a continuous text. It's only scholars who later on put in chapters and verses into it. Okay. And so chapter 2 begins by saying, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished." So it's all done and dusted. God made a home for the man, the son he wanted to create, his beloved son. Adam was his beloved son. And he peopled the whole heavens and the earth, that there was life all around him. Everywhere teemed with life and beauty and harmony and glory. And he said, "And the seventh day, God ended his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on that day he rested from all his work which God created and made." Now, people very often, even scholars, can presume that that's merely a statement of the fact that by the time these texts were written, that the Sabbath or the Shabbat was already being observed. But it's much, 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 much more than that. It's because God rested on the Sabbath that we learned to rest one day in 7 days. If we rest mind and soul and body for one day in 7 days, we will not have the sickness that we have. We will not have the traumas that we have. We will have recovery time. The resting is actually recovery. And so it means that if you're working for 6 days and you rest on the seventh day, your body, your soul, your mind, your whole being can recover. That recovery is actually very, very important. And as I pointed out to you in the ages of the human race, the seventh day, the most glorious day, is going to be the new era, which is coming. It's definitely coming. And it will be when the whole human race will actually enjoy being on the earth again. If you look at the human race now, it is struggling, it is warring, it's killing, it's destroying, it's sick, it's dying, and all the rest of it. It'll be unbelievable for us to have the human race actually enjoying its stay on the earth, being back in communion with God, being back in communion with creation, being back to health instead of sickness, wholeness instead of all this struggle. That is what the seventh day is. And so one of the errors that is being committed today is that people are working for 7 days. Therefore, they're stressed out. Therefore, they are ill. Therefore, they've got all kinds of problems. Therefore, they have problems in relationships. They don't have time for each other. If we understood the Sabbath, if we understood the Sabbath rest, we would enjoy not only our relationship with God, we would enjoy the relationship with each other as well. I think the whole concept of the Sabbath is extremely important. And God, I'll show you in Genesis, but in fact, I'd have to take you through the entire Bible to show you the whole picture. God tries very hard to bring us back to the Sabbath. And the redemption that Jesus brought to us was meant to begin this Sabbath day. The day of resurrection was meant to begin this Sabbath day. But of course, the whole of humanity has fallen back again and is overdue a time of chastisement or cleansing. So I think we will only understand the seventh day when it comes. May it come soon. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World Podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and others.